in my neighborhood, all the old buildings stood. They keep digging down and down, so that the cars can live underground. They're swinging on the wrecking ball through these laughing plaster walls, just letting all the shadows scream. I wish to follow me.
Well, hello. It's lovely to see you virtually all again, or at least to have the opportunity for you to see me and to be introduced to a wonderful piece of Russian literature, which is what we'll be looking at today. I hope that you've all been well and safe and that things have been going as smoothly as possible for you, given how strange the circumstances are that we find ourselves in. I began, as I will continue to do, with a piece of music. You always have the opportunity to listen to the Russian music that's posted on the website, but I wanted us to start off with a piece that's about gentrification and materialism in the case of Death Cab for Cutie, obviously in the city of Seattle, an amazing cosmopolitan, metropolitan space that is just on the west of our continent, and if you like, on the furthest east of the Pacific Ocean. On the other side of that giant body of water, the Pacific, is the most eastern part of Russia, including places like Vladivostok. And we're going to spend time today in the most western parts of Russia. That's to say, in the magical, terrifying, appalling, and remarkable city of St. Petersburg, with Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin, who is Russia's most admired author, often viewed as being the Shakespeare of the Russian tradition, the most classical and remarkable of figures. And so what I want to do today is take a little time to introduce you both to Pushkin's city and also to introduce you to him, and want to introduce you to the particular short story, Pikovaya Dama, the Queen of Spades. And that's actually the first thing I'd like you to think about as you are considering the story. The notion of the city being something we have to pay attention to, the notion of the city of St. Petersburg itself being a kind of character. Secondly, I'm going to ask you to think about the personality, the intense and charismatic personality of Pushkin himself. Everyone who read this story back in the day, everyone who reads this story nowadays, certainly in the Russian tradition, will know exactly who he is and will be aware of the mentality, of the psychology which he's invoking as he tells us this story about gambling and dreaming and murder in the city of St. Petersburg. And finally, of course, I want to look at the story itself with you. So I'm going to share the screen with you so that you'll have the opportunity to see what Petersburg itself looks like. So let me let this happen. And St. Petersburg here. The city was founded in 1703, and I want us to have that space particularly in mind. This is an illustration of the city of St. Petersburg just after its founding in the 18th century, as a very important Russian Tsarina, a German princess called Catherine the Great, built it into an important cultural setting, an important hub for business and commerce. Why did Peter pick this particular location? I wanted you to see the islands. I wanted you to see the Volga River as it makes the Neva River as it spills into the Gulf of Finland. I'm not quite sure what your images are of Russia, but to think of it as somewhere that can be cold and can be frozen is important. Peter wanted to build a city in St. Petersburg, of course, naming for his own saint name, Petersburg, wanted to build a city that would rival any city anywhere on the planet. Like the capital of the United States, however, and that's why I wanted to keep this image up just for a moment, Petersburg is not the ideal place to build a large stone city with granite embankments, where rivers join to gulfs. So I could think of Washington, D.C., or we could think of New Orleans once again. All kinds of difficulties can happen. Storms can come in off these bodies of oceans, and Petersburg has always been prone to flooding. So Peter builds what one contemporary would call an unnatural city. Pushkin, our poet himself, would write about it as being a city that should not exist, a city that was built on the bones of the humans who were forced to build it, a place that's full of danger and difficulty. Within a little over 100 years, and the image you have here is one that looks rather like what Pushkin's St. Petersburg might have looked like. The city has developed and has been made into a capital city. Art, music, wealth, military power are all being brought here into this space, which is a kind of window onto Europe. As Pushkin said in a famous poem about the city itself, a window that was hacked through, like with an axe, so as to give Russia an access to the West. Russia, and this is still true today, Russia is not part of the European Union. Russia always is trying to imagine, where does it belong? Does it belong with the West? Does St. Petersburg or Moscow somehow have its greatest connection to Paris, to London, to New York, to Los Angeles? Or should St. Petersburg and Moscow be considered something fundamentally Slavic, Russian, eastward looking, and not part of Europe? I want to show you this photograph, which I took a few years ago with some study abroad students from UT. We have an intensive Russian language program that runs most years. Sadly, it's been suspended this summer because of the COVID-19 difficulties, which runs in Moscow, but always has a trip to St. Petersburg. So the quiz that I would ask, we can't do this because obviously this is a captured lecture. The quiz I would ask is, what time of day was this photograph taken? There's a hint, if you know anything about St. Petersburg, what you're looking onto is the Admiralty, where the Russian Navy is based out of. So it seems to be quite daylight, it seems to be quite bright, but what you're looking at in the background is a very, very long sunset. And what you're looking at in the foreground is the bridges being raised. So when was this photograph taken? It was taken at 1 o'clock in the morning. The bridges come up at midnight every night so as to allow the shipping channels, the commerce and ships to pass under these very low slung bridges. I wanted to show you this because in addition to being a place of power, a place that's unnatural, forced labor was used actually to build the city by serfs, a kind of slavery system that was characteristic of Imperial Russia. In addition to being unnatural and forced and powerful and modern, the city of St. Petersburg is viewed as being, and here is where its myth, the myth of St. Petersburg comes into play, as being a kind of magical dreamlike place. In the summer, this particular view that you're looking at here is called the Bieli Nochi, the white nights. In fact, the sun never fully sets. It goes all the way down to the horizon, and yet never does the sky fully darken. Madness and all kinds of hallucinations and delusions are supposed to be triggered by the fact that when you're in St. Petersburg in the summer, the sun never sets. Just low to the horizon, and you can read a book. You could have read your PDF without a flashlight, without your cell phone, late at night. This also is an image of one of the most famous locations in St. Petersburg. This is the main square in front of the so-called Winter Palace, often referred to as the Hermitage, where Catherine lived, built by an Italian architect. This also is an image taken at the middle of the night in the summer, where Petersburg seems to float like a golden dream, like a kind of mirage on the edge of the Gulf of Finland. And there's a flip side to it, which I'll get to just in a moment. So Petersburg is a character. The city itself is going to be encouraging people to behave in certain sorts of ways, encouraging them to do strange and bizarre things, where the difference between what is real and what is imagined is often not very visible or clear. So I wanted to give you some images of Pushkin himself, a very famous individual, and of various people living in St. Petersburg in the period of the story, so that you could visually cast out the characters, Lizaveta, German, Tomsky, the various people that you meet here if you like. So this is an important portrait by Arest Kiprensky, who was a contemporary of Pushkin himself. And Pushkin decides to have himself presented here very much as a poet. And so again, I just want to remark a few things about his appearance. In the background here, you have the image of the muse with the lyre. This is his inspiration. The way in which his face is represented for us is also very characteristic of what will be called Romanticism, this early, inspired very much by Goethe's Faust, intense artistic movement at the start of the 19th century. The muse here inspires him, and the light of inspiration and the imagination bounces off his forehead. He's dressed himself in a style you'll see a couple of times in our next few stacks. Every detail of him says, hipster, boho chic, I'm an artist. The cut of his jacket, his fluffy tie. And then I did mention that he was Russian, and yet if you look at the scarf he's got over his shoulder, it's very clearly a Scottish plaid. He's decided to dress up like an artist from Europe, so very much a figure from the West. And his favorite writer at the time that he had this portrait done was actually from Scotland. So if he wants to represent himself as a chic, trendy, cosmopolitan author of the world, there are a couple of additional details I want to mention about Pushkin. Everyone knew him. When the story appeared, people would have connected that story to this particular individual. In addition to his fashionable sideburns, Bakembardi, these big sideburns were super trendy in the period. Two other elements are crucial. So how much do we know about Pushkin? We know so much that, and I want to focus just on his hand and the very long fingers that he has and the very long fingernails he has. It's very characteristic for someone who paints or writes, when they have a portrait done of them, to show the hand that is where they actually make the mark of their artistry, write down their poems, touch the paint onto their canvases. But Pushkin has unusually long nails, maybe suggesting he's a man who doesn't do hard work, manual labor. But those nails give me the chance to tell you a little anecdote that's a bit like Montaigne and his library as well. If you go to a little palace that's on the outskirts of St. Petersburg and to the small village in which Pushkin grew up as a boy, you'll find all of the books and all of the memorabilia that Pushkin had. And one of the things we have preserved once again is Pushkin's library. And when you go and look in his library, you can tell which books he admired, what things he liked to read. He read German quite well. He read some French. It doesn't seem that he knew too much English. But you'll see that when you open one of his books, there are little marks that are in the margin. And what Pushkin did is he would hold his book and he would use one of these long fingernails, kind of like a highlighter, to mark his favorite passages. And then when you read his poems or you'll read his short stories, you'll see him having quoted the text that he admired. So that's how much detail we know about Pushkin, literally his reading habits. Perhaps even more interesting than his personal quirky habits is his appearance. So Russia was highly racialized. Racial categories were distinctly separated, and that continued through the Soviet period. Pushkin, as we look at him, in this image does not appear as characteristically ethnically Russian. And so even before we get to Chinua Achebe, our great Nigerian novelist later, I want to introduce you to one of our first African diaspora authors and writers. Indeed, the 18th and early 19th century is when African diaspora writers, both in the Americas and globally, began to become more prominent. So Pushkin was extremely proud of the fact that he was the great-grandson of an important military leader, a military leader who was North African. His name was Ganibal Pushkin, and Pushkin was the name of the cannon that he used so effectively in battle that the Tsar liberated him and gave him his freedom. So Pushkin was heritage African diaspora, and profoundly proud of that heritage and of his distinguished and illustrious ancestor. By contrast, however, many Peterburgers had very mixed feelings about Pushkin. Indeed, he was subject to intense and persistent racial parody, characterization, and attacks. The image I'm giving you here is a cartoon that Pushkin did of himself, emphasizing in a way that actually the portrait doesn't quite, his ethnicity and his race. For years, people made his life difficult. Difficult perhaps because from the age of 17, he'd been declared the most accomplished writer in all of Russia, and yet this teenager wasn't even simply a Russian, or at least so his contemporaries thought. All of this rather came to a head because he was also someone who was famously very successful in love affairs with all genders. And this only increased the resentment. How dare this person, who wasn't really an aristocrat, because he wasn't, who wasn't really ethnically Russian, not only be an artistic success, but actually a personal and romantic success as well. I give you this image of the crucial opponent to Pushkin, and also as a way of thinking about conventional attitudes about what was attractive. Dantes, a person that anyone who loves Pushkin and his works, as I do, abominates, was the dashing young man who was attached to the French ambassador, to the French embassy